It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Stoke-on-Trent North. Whilst I don't agree with everything she said, her belief, her clarity, her lucidity shone through, and I thought it was a very good speech. The House would probably know that I would not be embarrassed to criticise the coalition government if I felt it necessary. And I have to say that I was a little nervous in the run-up to this Queen's speech by the possibility that with 10 months to go and two parties anxious to jockey for electoral advantage, we'd get rather a hollow vessel out of it. And indeed, we saw a little bit of that in the contribution of the Honourable Member for Gordon, who's sadly not here at the moment, who was clearly about who got the credit for the good bits of the speech. But in fact, I needn't worry. I think this is actually a remarkably good Queen's speech, particularly one that's got to fit into the last 10 months of the Parliament. And I had a wry smile when my right honourable friend, the member for Chesham and Amersham, referred to the comments from the Labour front bench about a zombie government, which I thought was rich, coming from a party which depends on rent control, price control and a variety of policies which did such horrible damage the last time they were used that I thought they were dead, buried at the crossroads with a stake through their heart. So that was interesting but wholly wrong. Now, I agreed very much with the speech, I thought a brilliant speech made by my right honourable friend for Wokingham and an equally brilliant speech made by my right honourable friend for Croydon, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. So it's taken out a great deal of what I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, you'll be glad to hear, and it makes the speech much shorter. So let me focus on just a few parts of what I think was a very valuable Queen's speech. The centrepiece in many ways, in domestic policy terms, was undoubtedly the pension reform proposals. Now, these, in many ways, have got their genesis in all parties. They're not just in our party, and indeed the genesis abroad in Holland. And in many ways, they're overdue. The Dutch system has long been, the Dutch system of pension provision has long been better than almost anybody else's, certainly better than ours after the difficulties engendered by Gordon Brown as Chancellor some decade or so ago. It's been much less expensive, much better returns over a 25-plus year time, which is what you have to look at for a pension return. Something like 30 to 40% better than what we achieve in this country. Astonishingly higher numbers than we achieve. So it's a very, very good proposal. But it is just the foundation stone. As we saw in 2008, the British financial services industry has something of a habit of using the asymmetry of information between the provider and the consumer to the advantage of the provider. So, for example, with profits life policies that used to exist, very, very similar in principle to what's being proposed, but they didn't work very well because the benefits went to the pension fund managers, not to the customers. So what's got to be included in the bill that is presented on this, it's very, very, very strong trustee management. Very strong indeed, to make up for that asymmetry of information and to make sure they're run firmly in the interests of the customers, the pensioners. They've got to have very, very good communications. Even a scheme like this, when the markets turn down dramatically, has to accommodate some tightening of a belt, tightening of belts from the point of view of their pensioners. But to give the House some context in this, when the Dutch had to face 2008, they had on average a 2% reduction in the benefits given. 2%. The biggest was 6%. Compare that to Britain, where annuity values dropped by 20% in that same time. So they have to be able to communicate that and have their pensioners and customers understand it, but nevertheless they're far more robust. But also it will only work, because this is an enabling scheme, it's not a mandatory scheme. It will only work if the employers themselves take it up, and they have to understand it's a defined contribution scheme and their liabilities will be pretty minimal under this scheme. So it ought to be beneficial to them. It ought to encourage a great deal of take-up. And I know a number of very large companies do want to take it up. However, I mean, that's why you've got the NAPF, the CBI, the TUC, and pretty much all the parties in this House in favour of this proposal. But I flag one concern. Whenever we have issues that come in front of this House about which there is no controversy across the two front benches, the legislation is almost invariably bad and flawed and goes wrong later. So I just flag that up. We ought to be ultra careful with this. However, it's not of itself a complete policy. And I do think it's been one of the neglected areas of modern politics, pension policy. It is, and we really do need to have a much more comprehensive policy. I mean, my honourable friend, the member for Cheshire Man Mission, mentioned the Equitable Life scandal and the fact that the government is just about providing appropriate benefits now or compensation now, but still not good enough, and it still has to revisit it. But I'll raise one point which I hope the front bench will note, and it's this, that this policy must not just be about things like automatic enrolment, things like this proposal. It must also be about our tax approach to pensions. And we have at the moment a complete piece of hypocrisy in our tax approach to pensions. The Gordon Brown Treasury introduced the lifetime allowance. And the purpose of this, I think, was to stop people using pensions as a tax avoidance regime. Fair enough, perfectly understandable. But that has been tightened and tightened and tightened so that now somebody on the salary of a head teacher or a GP or a middle-ranking manager or a reasonably successful solicitor, in other words, not mega millionaires, simply ordinary people who've had a moderately successful life, will run into pension levels of taxation at half the level, let's say a cabinet minister is paid, that sort of salary, run into pension levels of taxation of 55%. 55%. Now, at the moment, this is perhaps 1%, 2% of the population. If this pension scheme works with 30% greater returns, it'll be a much bigger proportion of the population. And what's more, after a while, when the Treasury is dependent on a large tranche of money, it'll not be able to retract it. So I just ask them to think, to think that if we're going to have a very successful, once again, have one of the best pension systems in the world, we should think not just about the systems we use, but also about the tax treatment, which could be very unfair on good citizens who've done the right thing and put in money in a proper way. The second issue which I want to pick up is the recall bill. Now, the Coalition promised this at the beginning of this Parliament, I think in a flush of good intentions, and then regretted it ever since, because it's proved pretty unpopular with colleagues, of course, for fairly obvious reasons. And when the proposals that were put up, the Deputy Prime Minister proposals were put up, they got a pretty rough treatment from the relevant Select Committee for a number of reasons. Now, I support the idea of recall. I guess I'm the only person in this House to have recalled myself. But I support the idea of recall. But it failed. I got sent back. There is one simple concern in it I have about it, and it's this. If we do what the original proposal was, and that is make it subject to a House of Commons trigger, I fear that it will be very unfair. Looking back over about 20 years of the Privileges Committee and the other mechanisms penalising members for misdemeanours of smaller or greater size, it is as plain as a pikestaff. And I'm not going to pick out individual cases, so please don't intervene and ask. But it's as plain as a pikestaff that people outside the system, the mavericks, the ones who are not perhaps popular with their own front benches, get a different standard of treatment to those who are inside the system, the cabinet ministers and the shadow cabinet ministers and so on. And you don't need to take my word, go look, go list the most draconian penalties and the least draconian penalties for what's gone wrong. So I would resist fiercely any proposal that gave that decision to any organisation that's controlled or influenced by the whip's offices, and I used to be a whip, the whip's offices or the front benches of either side, or indeed the establishment of the House even. And I would rather see something which is solely democratic recall and originated in constituencies, right enough with a decently high level of a hurdle, so it's not misused, than C1, which is under the control, indirect or direct, of the establishment in this House. So I give that warning to the front bench because I shall be actively pursuing that particular case and trying to make sure that what I've described, the vice that I've described, is avoided. Now, of course, in every Queen's speech, there's a phrase, other measures will be laid before you. And it's the thing which all of us hope will lead to the matters that have been left out that we would rather see in the speech. And I want to raise one issue which will surprise my colleagues on this side of the House. There is no reference to the National Health Service Bill, and many will be wiping their brow and saying, thank God for that. Now, that's because the National Health Service bills that we've had in modern times have always had something of an ideological content. An ideological content that has divided between parties and often within parties. The Labour Party had its internal divisions on this, and as has the coalition had its internal divisions. And of course, one NHS bill pretty much crashed and burned. But what this ideological battle has done is covered up something else, and that is the serial failures of the health service, whether it's mid-staffs or whether it is simply the lack of use of best practice, or whether it's the tens of thousands of people every year who die unnecessarily in the health service for a variety of reasons. And it seems to me that actually, as a responsible government, the coalition government in the last year is a good one to do it, there is scope for some non-ideological action on the health service. Now, I'm going to cite one example. I could cite dozens, but I know Madam Deputy Speaker wants me to be brief. I'll cite one example. NICE was set up by the Labour government with the very best of intentions. Very sensible idea. We're going to have a rational approach to the... Since we've got rationing of drugs and therapies, we should have a rational approach to that. Sadly, what's happened over the years is that although they've done a reasonably good job, it's become apparent that many of the approaches they use are incredibly judgmental, the so-called quality adjusted life years, QALYs. You know, it's clear this is a very, very judgmental thing. They're making forward-looking judgments and predictions, if you like, about the effectiveness of drugs. And this is done as a rationing and a cost control mechanism. And it's become out of date in the last year or two. The reason it's become out of date in the last year or two is because there is now a deal between the government and the pharmaceutical industries which limits the maximum spend on drugs. What happens is there is a rebate paid back from the industry to government in the next 2 years for everything goes, I think it's 12 billion. And after that, there's a limited growth rate. What this means is actually that new drugs are in effect at a zero marginal cost. Nobody's thought this through in the health service. It's been raised once or twice. But what we ought to be doing is changing NICE's approach to make it far more aggressive, far more experimental, far more willing to try out the drug for a year or two in the marketplace to see if it actually delivers, than is currently the case. It will have two effects. One, it will save thousands of lives. Secondly, it will actually act, because of the way the subvention, the rebate mechanism works, all of the industry rebates, but the innovators will gain and the non-innovators will lose as a result of the mechanism. So I just put that up as an example. It's by no means the only one, but I think there are many... Of course, I'll give way. Yes.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. I think the idea he's just floated is a really interesting and really powerful one. What would he say to the people who will then worry that new drugs and massive innovation being brought to the marketplace, sometimes those drugs go wrong and people worry about the negligence claims and the claims are made against pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah. I mean, when drugs get to the point of being in front of NICE, they've already got their safety protocols established. So this is not something which would be problematic in safety terms. And what is more, I mean, there was an article in the paper the other day by Professor John Waxman, and he cited drugs about prostate cancer. If they didn't provide those prostate cancer drugs, the people are going to die anyway. I mean, that's, you know, we're talking about extensions of life, not complete rescue. So it doesn't actually affect the safety issue. It does affect the prospect of life for people who've got otherwise terminal diseases. So it's well worthwhile doing. Finally, I just want to make a constitutional point, again precipitated by the comments from my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the member for Chesham Amersham, on on collective responsibility. One of the contentious issues in this last year or two, within and outside the coalition, has been the issue of a referendum on the European Union. Now, what has happened last year, of course, is we had a private members' bill. The Conservative Party effectively had a private members' bill on this. Why did this happen? This happened because, although there are, whatever it is, 60 Liberal Democrat MEPs on the government side of the House, both sides of the coalition have an effective veto on presenting legislation to the House. This seems to me entirely improper, indeed undemocratic. Why not? Let us take my example of the referendum bill, but it doesn't just apply to this. Why not, if there is an argument inside government, say, let the House of Commons decide? Put the bill to the House of Commons. After all, we no longer accept that a vote lost in the House of Commons leads to a fall of the government. There's an explicit prevention of that in the fixed-term Parliament bill. Act rather. So why not put these things? So then when we go into the next election, for example, on that matter, they can see exactly how everybody voted. So we're no longer relying on promises of parties, we're relying on actions of parties. It seems to me that something has gone wrong in the structure here. It may well be the civil service, or it might be the original coalition agreement. But it seems to me that if we are going to have a proper coalition, the coalition should be more open rather than more closed. It should give more power to the House of Commons, not less. And if we did that, that would really make this an extraordinarily good Queen's speech.
Hugh Bailey.